From Palermo to Chicago, from Istanbul to Tokyo, from Shanghai to Marseille, mafias are never born by chance. They're born in the dark, in the cracks of weak states and the rot of corrupt elites. They rise in silence, hidden behind storefronts and political smiles. Until one day, you realize they're everywhere, feeding off illegal trade, infiltrating the powerful, and financing an invisible economy that now threatens the very idea of democracy. Among the most elusive and least understood, yet quietly, one of the most powerful, is the Corsican Mafia. For over a century, it spread across the globe like wildfire, rooted in Marseille, branching into Saigon, North Africa, and Latin America. It was forged not just by crime, but with the quiet complicity of the French state itself. It began with desperation. Corsica in the early 20th century was suffocating in poverty. Its young fled in droves, hoping to survive on the French mainland. In Marseille, one of the Mediterranean's great ports, they found a city of transit, of raw materials and luxury goods, of smugglers and street girls, of honest labor and cutthroat rackets. The dockyards were teeming with people who needed to eat. And for some, crime became a quicker route to survival. Among the exiles was a young man from the central Corsican village of Casamacioli. His name was Simon Sabiani. At 20, he was studying law and doing business. But when the First World War broke out, like every young Corsican, he was thrown into the trenches. It was there, knee-deep in blood and mud, that Sabiani met another Corsican who would come to mean everything in this story, Paul Carbone. Carbone was from Propriano, but raised in Marseille, a natural-born outlaw. Before the war, he'd already done time for assault and had been shipped off to the notorious disciplinary battalions in Africa, where France sent the worst of its bad men. In the trenches of Champagne, Carbone had a trick. He used a knife to keep corpses stiff in their coffins. War taught him death was just another transaction. When it ended, Sabiani returned to Marseille and entered politics. Carbone returned too, but he went looking for opportunity. Sabiani had lost 3 brothers in the war. That pain hardened him. He drifted left, joined the socialists, then the communists, and finally founded his own faction. The autonomous Communist Federation, rising fast in Marseille's Corsican districts. His base dock workers, petty clerks, customs agents, and the unemployed. He gave speeches, organized committees, founded mutual aid groups, and turned himself into a neighborhood messiah. The game was clientelism, the old trade of votes for favors. You needed a permit, a job, a place to stay? You went to Sabiani. As his daughter would later recall, there were always people at the door, beggars, workers, even thugs, asking for help, for jobs at City Hall, for reduced fines. If he could help, he did. But nobody got anything for free. One of the first people Sabiani helped was a woman, the mother of a trench comrade named Walker, and that's how the circle began to close. Carbone, now back in Marseille, took a job with Messageries Maritimes, the colonial shipping line. He was crisscrossing the seas, moving from port to port, watching, learning, smuggling. The Corsican diaspora had sunk deep roots in France's overseas empire, Indochina, Algeria, Lebanon. Some served as colonial bureaucrats, others as fixers. Some, like Carbone, lived in both worlds, part businessman, part outlaw. By the early 1920s, Carbone was trafficking opium. He was building a network that followed the Corsican migration map. Wherever the French flag had flown, there was a Corsican who owed him a favor. That's how the game worked. A cousin's friend. A friend's cousin. No questions asked. Then Carbone met his other half. In Cairo, he was introduced to François Spirito, a brutal Corsican who'd been in Marseille since childhood and ran a corner of the white slave trade. Together, they were unstoppable. Carbone, the smooth operator, Spirito, the savage enforcer. They were kicked out of Egypt and returned to Marseille, where they built their empire from scratch. They trafficked girls, opium, and information. They paid off the police. They made the rules in the underworld, and by the late 1920s, they owned Marseille's nights, gambling dens, brothels, smuggling routes. And then they made the final step. They got political. In 1928, Sabiani was elected deputy. He knew exactly who Carbone and Spirito were, and he didn't care. In fact, he needed them. The old socialist mayor of Marseille, Simeon Flessière, was in his 80s and facing re-election. His own party had abandoned him. So he struck a deal with Sabiani. Support me, and you'll be my first deputy. Sabiani agreed, but he needed muscle. Carbone delivered. Election meetings were held in bars owned by Corsicans, where fists flew and guns sometimes followed. Carbone's men handled security, broke up the opposition, stuffed ballot boxes, and kept order, Corsican style. In return, Sabiani promised them jobs at City Hall. When Flessières died in office 2 years later, the council elected Sabiani mayor in all but name. Carbone, now embedded in the city's administration, had people placed everywhere. Police, fire brigade, sanitation, cemeteries. They owned the streets, and now they owned the system. By the early 1930s, Sabiani was making trips to Paris, building alliances. One man he courted was the city's police prefect, Jean Chiappe, a virulent anti-communist who turned a blind eye to gang violence if it helped crush the left. Chiappe's problem was Paris's growing Corsican crime wave. Vendettas, knife fights, and blood feuds erupting in the streets. The gangs were organizing, and Chiappe needed a message sent. So Sabiani introduced him to Carbone and Spirito. The signal was clear. These men are mine. Let them work. It was around this time that Carbone began experimenting with the next big thing: heroin. He opened the first crude labs near Bandel, outside Marseille. He hired chemists who would later perfect the process, creating the template for what would become the French connection. The Parisian elite, meanwhile, partied with Carbone and Spirito like nothing was wrong. At galas and private clubs, they mingled with Jean Gabin, Tino Rossi, and Stavisky, the great conman of the interwar years. Stavisky had bought off judges, journalists, and politicians. When he was exposed and found dead, allegedly by suicide, in January 1934, the Republic trembled. Then came February 6th, 1934. Right-wing mobs stormed the National Assembly. The police opened fire, 16 dead, over 1,000 wounded. The government fell. Chiappe was sacked. Carbone and Spirito lost their Parisian protection. Soon after, the magistrate investigating Stavisky, Albert Prince, was found dead on a railway track, decapitated. The press erupted. Rumors swirled. Carbone and Spirito were arrested. Even the Baron de Lussac, Carbone's high society fixer, was taken in. Sabiani stood by them. He plastered Marseille with posters that read, "That one is my friend and will remain my friend." In a nation of clientelism, that was the highest loyalty a politician could offer. For the first time, the gangster-politician bond wasn't hidden. It was declared. Eventually, the charges didn't stick. The 3 men were cleared and released. Sabiani organized a hero's welcome. There's a photo, one of only 2 that exist, taken in the back room of a restaurant, Carbone, Spirito, and Sabiani, arms around each other, champagne in hand. The real City Hall. But Sabiani's reign wouldn't last forever. In 1935, a new socialist rival, Henri Tasso, challenged him in the municipal elections. Tasso had his own 2 young Corsican pimps from Calenzana, Antoine and Barthélemy Guérini. Like Carbone and Spirito before them, they started with a bar and a girl. Then came muscle. Then came power. The streets ran red again, Corsican factions were at war. Marseille was becoming France's Chicago. Carbone was Capone, and the French Republic had let them in through the front door. On a cold and frigid day in early May 1926, deep within the yellowing folds of the Catholic press, a haunting revelation pierced through the polite facades of international diplomacy and global headlines. The Corsican Mafia, dreaded, resilient, and largely unknown to the wider world, had been brought to heel by the iron will of Benito Mussolini. At least, that was the story they wanted to tell. Throughout history, there have been secret societies, underground brotherhoods, and criminal confederations that thrived on one sacred principle: anonymity. That anonymity was power. It was their oxygen. As long as no one could put a name to their face, a face to their crimes, they were untouchable. They were the smoke in the alley, the whisper in the court, the ghost in the room. They moved money, bodies, politics, and nations, but their names rarely made the paper. That veil of secrecy allowed them to serve monarchies, empires, democracies, and juntas with equal cold-blooded efficiency. But something began to shift in the 20th century. New administrations came and went. New technology brought voices farther and louder. And in that shift, a new kind of enemy emerged. Not from a police precinct or a rival gang, but from the newsstand. The press. Tiny articles, often buried deep in the paper, began to chip away at the wall. By the time Life magazine ran a spread, or Time mentioned them by name, the game was already halfway lost. The age of invisible empires was ending. Public pressure was now real, and the government could no longer claim ignorance. That pressure reached a breaking point in 1951, when a square-jawed Southern senator named Estes Kefauver dragged the truth into American living rooms through the power of television. The Kefauver hearings didn't just expose a few crooks. They revealed an entire syndicate, Italians, Jews, Irish, working together like a boardroom of vice. It wasn't just the mafia anymore, it was a mafia with a global charter. And as America spread its influence through Europe after the Second World War, pouring money into nations like France, Greece, and Italy, the lines between government, reconstruction, and criminal empires began to blur. The Central Intelligence Agency, under Alan Dulles and James Jesus Angleton, wanted more than stability. They wanted control. Through Operation Gladio, they built alliances with criminal groups who could do what governments couldn't. And the Corsican Mafia, the FCM, was more than willing. What had once been a vendetta-based honor culture on the rugged hills of Napoleon's homeland had evolved into an international black market power. The Corsicans, forged in blood feuds and family vengeance, were efficient, brutal, and adaptable. And unlike their Italian cousins, they didn't crave the spotlight. They were the quiet professionals of organized crime. In the Catholic Press article from May 6, 1926, the Corsican Mafia was painted as a relic of medieval lawlessness, an offshoot of the vendetta, with entire families lying in wait for opportunities to avenge imagined slights. Sicily may have professionalized it, forming a syndicate of blackmailers and killers to protect their own, but it was in Corsica that the seeds were first sown. They operated under the same code as the old blood cults: kill if necessary, stay silent always. That silence made them dangerous. Mussolini worsted us. So, when he declared war on the mafia in the mid-1920s, it wasn't just bluster. His regime conducted mass arrests. 600 men swept up in one wave, including mayors, village officials, and family bosses. They were deported to isolated islands, cut off from the world like infected limbs. For a brief moment, the Italian state claimed victory. The mafia had been squelched, declared the press. And yet, within a decade, Mussolini himself would lie broken beneath his own people, while the mafia quietly rebuilt. What the newspapers didn't understand was that the Corsican Mafia, unlike its Sicilian counterpart, had no interest in public showdowns. They didn't wage wars in the street or leave horses' heads in beds. They wove themselves into the undercurrents of society, the docks, the customs offices, the port authorities. They controlled the flow of heroin through Marseille. They guarded French presidents, then plotted their assassinations. They didn't need a throne. They preferred the shadows behind it. And in those shadows, as the Cold War dawned, and America's secret wars expanded into Asia and Latin America, the Corsicans became key players. Smugglers, enforcers, fixers. They worked with the French intelligence services, then the Americans, then whoever paid the most, and us the least. From Saigon to Havana, from Marseille to Mexico, their fingerprints were on every kilo of heroin that hit American streets. By the time John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, the Corsican Mafia had already been offered a contract on a high-ranking American politician. They refused, but they remembered the details. The job was commissioned out of New Orleans, Louisiana Bayou country, where mob kings like Carlos Marcello reigned in silence and style. The man requesting the job never said the name, just described it as the highest office in the land. The Corsicans turned it down, but noted the source. It was a syndicate with deep intelligence ties, one of the oldest, one of the most protected. And so this documentary begins, Press Bonanza, The Corsican Files, Part 1. A chaptered descent through 45 years of headlines, rumors, arrests, whispers, and revelations. From 1926 to 1971, these are the stories the newspapers told, and the truths they never quite understood. On a crisp October night in 1928, as the leaves began to fall and the chill of winter crept along the alleyways of Washington, D.C., the silence was shattered by gunfire. Swift, brutal, and without warning. The city wasn't alone. That same night, bullets tore through the back streets of Philadelphia, echoed across Chinatown in New York, and left blood on the pavement in Chicago. 10 men were murdered in a single coordinated rampage, victims of a war most Americans couldn't begin to understand. The Chinese tongs were back. The American press loved to say the vendetta was something foreign, something backward, something left behind in the hills of Corsica or the hollers of Kentucky. But this was new, brutal, modern. The murders are almost beyond the barbarities of the Corsican Mafia, declared the Evening Star, horrified by the cold indifference of the killers. No warnings needed, just death, handed out like calling cards. No personal grudges, just blood owed to a name, to a tong. The On Leong and Hip Sing organizations had signed a perpetual truce in March of 1927. Just over a year later, they were at war again. And the rules were as simple as they were terrifying. If you belonged to the wrong tong, you were marked. It didn't matter what you did. It didn't matter where you were. The bullets didn't care if you were innocent. And suddenly, the narrative shifted. These weren't just gangsters. These were something deeper, an invisible society embedded within another invisible society. The press wanted answers. Were these criminal syndicates Chinese imports? A cultural cancer smuggled in through immigration channels? Or was something more uniquely American at play? The truth, as the article pointed out with a tone both startled and smug, was this. The tongs weren't foreign at all. They were born here. Not in Beijing, not in Shanghai. In America. In the smoke-filled backrooms of San Francisco. In the gambling dens of New York. In the shadows of Chicago. These weren't ancient institutions. They were modern byproducts of territory disputes between illegal gambling houses in cities where protection was something you bought from a crooked cop, not earned in a courtroom. A tong didn't declare war on a rival casino. It declared war on everyone associated with that rival. If a single gambling operation tried to open on a block claimed by a rival, the streets turned red. And the targets weren't just the operators. They were the kitchen boys, the runners, the families. It was total war. This was not some exotic contagion infecting American streets. It was a creature of America's own making, a society corrupted not by immigrants, but by the system that allowed protection to be auctioned off by the beat cop and enforced with a pistol. But as the bodies piled up, so too did the rhetoric. Lawmakers began calling for mass deportations. Bills were introduced in Congress, like the 1926 Miller Bill, which sought to deport any alien connected to a Tong. But the courts hit a wall. Many of these men were born in the United States, citizens by birthright. You couldn't deport what you couldn't define as foreign. The Department of Labor opposed the bill, not out of sympathy, but out of principle. If you made it legal to deport Chinese Americans for gang ties, where would it end? Italians next, Irish, Jews. The law had to punish actions, not ancestry. Still, outrage simmered. The editorials roared. Why couldn't America deal with its gangsters the way Mussolini was crushing the mafia in Italy? Why couldn't America be as ruthless, as decisive, as dictatorial? Because America lived in a glass house, they admitted, throwing stones at heathen Chinese, while letting Kentucky families shoot each other to death in backwoods feuds, while their own mafia operated under the noses of complicit authorities. A Chinese diplomat, anonymous but sharp-tongued, summed it up bitterly. In China, if a man defied the law, he'd be beheaded. In America, he buys off the police. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on anyone. The Tongs thrived because the American system allowed them to, bought time for them, bought them safety, bought them silence. And while the press tried to draw lines between Chinese violence and Sicilian vendettas, or compare the Tongs to the Corsican Mafia, what they were really exposing was a pattern. It wasn't the culture that bred crime, it was the environment. And America had become a greenhouse for gangsters. Just 5 years later, in the sweltering heat of July 1933, a column buried in the Democrat and Chronicle delivered a quiet, philosophical blow. "We have not produced the gangster," it said. "We have merely given him a new name." The article, dense with dry wit and laced with historical bite, traced the lineage of organized criminals back through time: Attila, Genghis Khan, Timur. The Boston Tea Party was a gang action of its own kind, they mused. Even England had its Robin Hoods and highwaymen. What America had done, perhaps, was simply add neon lights and machine guns. The gangster was just a man with a plan, a weapon, and no patience for law. What made him dangerous wasn't his heritage. It was the system's inertia. The real enemy wasn't the gangster himself. It was the apathy that let him live like a king. "We are learning," the column concluded, "where the weaknesses are in our legal combat with him." But even in 1933, they knew it would take more than outrage and legislation. It would take courage, and more importantly, it would take action. Not words on a page, not headlines. Because underneath the names, On Leong, Hip Sing, Corsican, Sicilian, Black Hand, Camorra, was the same truth. These men didn't fear jail. They feared silence breaking, anonymity shattered, and that's exactly what these newspapers had begun to do. By late November 1934, winter's chill did little to cool the fever-gripping Paris. Behind the gilded facades of its cafes and cabarets, a different kind of aristocracy held court, one forged not by bloodlines, but by vice, bribery, and bullets. And at the heart of this underworld sat a woman with ice in her veins and poison in her smile, a Polish countess, draped in wealth and scandal, tied by whispers to the Corsican Mafia and protected by the shadows. The French Sûreté Générale was closing in on a man named Mariani, a Corsican-born gangster who ran Lille and the North Coast's gambling racket with military precision and sociopathic flair. The newspapers painted him as a detective turned devil, a man whose fortune had been built not just on roulette wheels and rigged dice, but on narcotics, blackmail, and flesh. He was the kind of man who didn't just bribe judges, he made sure they had sins worth hiding. But it wasn't just Mariani they were after. Behind the velvet curtains of Paris's private salons, the name of the Countess echoed like a ghost story. She was a trafficker of women, a hostess to millionaires, and, according to the Sunday Mail, a woman who could turn the desires of the rich into a trap they never saw coming. Born into scandal, raised in the darkest trades of Poland's black market, she had refined the ancient art of white slavery into something that masqueraded as elegance. Her game was simple and devastating. Befriend the elite, disarm them with charm, and deliver them, unknowingly, to men who had already paid for them. She ran Deauville and Cannes like a spider runs its web. Victims included dancers, actresses, even the second wife of a Brazilian millionaire, lured into a luxury limousine and delivered to what she thought was a villa, only to find herself inside a finely decorated brothel, the door locked behind her. The Countess long gone. The financial side was managed with ruthless professionalism. Large fees, sometimes as high as £5,000, passed hands. A cut always found its way back to Mariani, who likely offered protection and kept inconvenient witnesses permanently silent. Paris whispered about the Cuban woman who vanished, the Polish dancer who died at Le Tréport, another beautiful girl killed without reason. No charges, no suspects, just bodies, just silence. Then came the Stavisky affair, a tidal wave of scandal. Stavisky, the fraudster who knew too much about too many, was found with a bullet in his head just as he was about to talk. Suicide, the papers said, with quotation marks so heavy they could barely be lifted. Then Judge Prince, the man who had lived a double life fueled by bribes and lust, was suddenly struck by a train. Paris began to ask, were all these deaths connected? Was this a system? Was there a hidden world beneath the city that answered to no nation, no law, no God? By the time Mariani was arrested, the Countess had vanished. The blue train murders, the sudden disappearances, the trail of blood leading to nowhere. France was starting to see it. There wasn't just one gang, one rogue cop, or one woman with expensive perfume and dirty secrets. There was a network, international, invisible. And Corsica, hard, wild, and forgotten, was the quiet eye of that storm. It was an island whose history was steeped in vendetta, but by the 20th century it had evolved into something far more profitable, more professional. The Mafia of Corsica didn't just protect bloodlines, it protected routes, secrets, smuggling lanes, ports. The Countess wasn't an anomaly, she was an asset, a weapon in a war of influence waged between underworld kings and upper-class degenerates. And that war didn't end in the 1930s. By December 1961, another mystery unfolded, this time not in Paris, but deep in the crystalline waters off the Corsican coast. A young diving instructor named André Mattei was found dead in Propriano, riddled with 6 bullets. His crime? He had claimed to know the location of a long-lost treasure, one buried by the retreating Afrika Korps of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel in 1943. A legend whispered for decades that beneath a grotto near Bastia lay chests of Nazi gold, diamonds, and plunder. Rommel's treasure was more than just wartime myth. It was a prize large enough to make men betray their blood, and enough to draw the Corsican Mafia out of its shadows. Mattei's murder was no robbery gone wrong. No random act. The timing, the precision, it reeked of a warning. The treasure's tale began with a German soldier named Peter Fleig, who in 1948 claimed he'd helped bury the loot on Hitler's orders. His story was just loud enough to attract attention. Then he vanished. Beat up. Possibly tortured. Maybe killed. Another diver, working in 1958 with the backing of a rich Englishwoman's yacht, received a phone call and fled the island overnight. Word on the street was clear. The Mafia had drawn a line around the seabed. Corsica, once the stage for vendettas and smuggling, had become the meeting point of war, wealth, and blood. The island's Mafia, rooted in centuries of vengeance, had now evolved into something stranger, something more dangerous. It no longer killed for family pride. It killed to protect assets, operations, political leverage. The old vendettas had grown up. Now they wore suits, carried briefcases, and hid their bullets in stories that the press couldn't quite believe. Rommel's gold, Stavisky's secrets, the Countess's list of lovers, all tied together by one invisible hand. And in every case, when someone got too close to the truth, someone else pulled the trigger. By September of 1963, the Corsican Mafia had graduated from whispered legends and lurid headlines to literary cannon fodder. In Ian Fleming's On Her Majesty's Secret Service, James Bond didn't just shoot his way through enemy fortresses. He enlisted the Corsican underworld itself to help him defeat a Soviet-backed biological threat. Helicopters, heroin, and heraldry, fiction maybe, but grounded in shadows just real enough to sting. The line between Fleming's fantasy and reality was blurring, and the Corsican Mafia, once just a rumor in the Paris press, had become a character in its own right. In the Bond universe, the Corsican mob was suave, strategic, and ruthless, just like 007 himself. The novel flung them into the Alps, gave them French OAS connections, and painted them as gatekeepers to the darkest alleys of international crime. It was absurd, escapist, and completely entertaining. But it was also a warning dressed up in tuxedos and martinis. The underworld was evolving, and the Corsicans were no longer just dockside knifemen or Marseille peddlers. They were part of the geopolitical stage now. Just 3 years later, in January 1966, that fiction was swallowed whole by reality. In Paris, Bernard Kaplan of Nana dropped a bombshell that barely made a ripple in polite society, but sent shockwaves through those who knew how the game was played. The biggest heroin bust in the transatlantic drug trade had just happened, and it didn't involve any trench-coated couriers or dockside handoffs. It involved a deep freezer, a United States warrant officer, and a retired army major living quietly in Orleans. It started with a soldier named Harold Condor returning home from France. A routine shipment of household goods arrived in Georgia. Inside the PX-issued freezer was $18 million worth of heroin. Not grams, not ounces, pure bulk. Enough to numb a generation. It was a moment that rewrote the rules. Gone were the days of professional couriers. The Corsican Mafia had gone freelance, outsourcing the work to soldiers, students, and tourists. The French police, already tracking 3 known racketeers who had flown to New York to collect the drugs, fed the intel to the US Justice Department. The takedown spanned both sides of the Atlantic. 8 arrests, 4 Frenchmen, 1 American soldier, 1 retired army major named Samuel Desist, a man whose resume read like a defense contractor's dream. A former US Army PR officer with a French wife and 2 children, Desist had lived in Orleans for years. He hosted dinners, smiled for photos, and, allegedly, handed over a freezer full of heroin. Even local officers didn't believe it at first. Not Desist, they said. He was a fixture in the community, a trusted expat, a patriot. But the evidence didn't lie. Somewhere along the line, this man had become a middleman, one link in a chain that stretched from the poppy fields of the East to the crackling streets of Harlem. The Corsican Mafia, the same network that had once worked brothels and casinos with aristocrats in Deauville, had now spread across the map, and they weren't in Marseille anymore. Their base of operations had moved inland, quiet villas in the foothills of the maritime Alps. One arrest, in the spring before the Condor bust, revealed a narcotics dealer named Joseph Cesare running a lab out of his mountain estate. The heroin was being processed closer to the Riviera now, far from the eyes of Interpol and the old Marseille task force. The French police called it decentralization. But it was more than that. It was an evolution. The Corsican Mafia had become a franchise. Independent operators, suburban labs, retired soldiers, a global network of nobodies, moving product like pros, hidden beneath layers of legitimacy. They had adapted. They had infiltrated. Italy had once been the gatekeeper of heroin. But by the mid-1960s, France had taken the reins. Why? Geography, infrastructure, proximity. Flights from Paris to New York were daily. Ports in Le Havre and Marseille never slept. The language barrier was thinner. And unlike Italy, where the Mafia wore its power like a crown, the Corsicans wore theirs like a cloak. No code of silence needed. They simply never said a word to begin with. Even the French police, when speaking off the record, admitted the truth. France was the new hub. The Corsicans were the new kings. Back in America, the press treated it as another strange footnote, a military man caught up in drugs. But behind the headlines, the agencies knew what this meant. If a man like Samuel Desist, former officer, respected father, could be working for the Corsican mob, then anyone could be. Teachers, diplomats, students with a backpack full of souvenirs and a kilo taped to the lining. This wasn't a war anymore. It was a market, a pipeline, a shadow economy built on addiction, desperation, and precision. And the Corsicans, those shadow lords of the Riviera, had turned the globe into a roulette table. By December of 1967, it was no longer a matter of speculation. It was geography. The Mafia had moved north. The ice-crusted boulevards of Montreal and the polished corridors of Toronto were no longer safe from the long reach of organized crime. The term Mafia made the Royal Canadian Mounted Police twitch, but the facts no longer cared about semantics. Whether you called it the Mafia, the Syndicate, or organized crime, it was here, embedded like frost in the cracks of the Canadian system. Former RCMP Commissioner C.W. Harvison didn't like the word Mafia. It was too Hollywood, too Sicilian, too easy. He preferred something colder. Organized crime, he said flatly, as if the precision of the term could somehow hold back the flood. But behind the reserved tone was something closer to dread. It is establishing itself in Canada, Harvison warned from Ottawa. There is still time to fight it. But we must act soon, and fast. That was 4 years after his retirement, and by then even Washington had stopped pretending Canada was clean. George Gaffney, Deputy Commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics and one of the earliest war dogs against the Mafia, didn't mince words. If Canada wants to play ostrich and pretend the Mafia doesn't exist, well, that's their business, he told the press, but it's already ahead of them. Montreal, he said, wasn't just a problem. It was a base, a launch pad for Corsican heroin into the United States. Toronto had its connections too, cross-border deals with Buffalo and Detroit. But it was Montreal, with its French-speaking population and convenient proximity to European shipping lanes, that had become the sweetheart city for the Corsican Mafia's transatlantic traffic. The heroin was pure, deadly, and methodical in its travel, from Turkish poppy fields to the labs of Syria and Lebanon, then across the Mediterranean to Marseille. From there it entered the bloodstream of the Western world through 1,000 smuggling veins, Montreal, New York, Mexico. Wherever there was a port, there was a point of entry. And at each step of the way, the Corsicans were not just present, they were commanding. What had started as an alliance between the Corsican Mafia and the Italian syndicates had slowly evolved. No longer middlemen, the Corsicans were now going direct. They controlled the supply chain from the raw opium to the street-level pusher. And as the market exploded, the faces at the street level changed too, no longer just Italians or French. Now it was black and Puerto Rican communities taking the fall, while the Corsicans counted cash from villas in the Midi. Meanwhile, in Toronto, civic officials still clung to their denials like old winter coats. They claimed no mafia operated there. But in the back rooms of Washington, no one was laughing anymore. "We pretended it wasn't a threat back in 1935, Gaffney said. "Now look at us." Arrests were rising. 47 in 1960, over 1,000 by 1966. But so was the mafia's footprint. From laundromats and vending machines to narcotics and prostitution, they were using old money to buy new respectability. And when that failed, they used silence. "When it comes to talking or going to jail," Gaffney muttered grimly, "most mafia members would rather go to jail. At least you're alive in jail." Across the border, the warning was clearer than ever. In his book, The Horsemen, Harvison prophesied the coming storm. "Someday we will be forced to drastically overhaul our system of administering justice. Someday the public will be compelled to look directly at the problem, rather than looking away in the hope that it will disappear." Someday had already arrived. And in France, just 2 years later, the truth became too grotesque to hide behind euphemism. In March of 1969, the scandal broke like a bottle of absinthe across the face of French politics. Georges Pompidou, former premier and soon-to-be president of the Fifth Republic, was publicly linked to a murder case so lurid it made the Profumo affair look like a schoolyard squabble. The victim, Stefan Markovitch, age 31. Former bodyguard to French film star Alain Delon. Playboy, fixer, and, according to more than one police source, blackmailer of the rich and powerful. Markovitch was found dead in October, shot in the head. The first autopsy said beaten. A second, more secretive one revealed the truth: gunshot. The stakes went from gangland hit to political time bomb overnight. The investigation spiraled. Markovitch's brother Alexandra stepped forward with a letter. "If anything happens to me," it read, "go to Alain Delon, his wife, and Francois Marcantoni, a real gangster." Marcantoni wasn't just a gangster. He was Corsican, old school, tied deep into the underworld. A man whose name echoed in the corridors of Marseille's heroin labs and in the club rooms of the Riviera's elite. He was arrested, but not convicted. Not yet. Defense lawyers demanded the testimony of Pompidou and his wife to deny they had ever dined with Delon and the Markovitch brothers. It was a strategic move, one meant to weaken Alexandra's credibility, but it also dragged the highest levels of the French Republic into the same swamp the Corsican Mafia had operated in for decades. What began as a murder was quickly understood to be something else entirely. Markovitch had been throwing parties, private ones, wild ones, with film stars, politicians, writers. There were photographs, there were films, and there were whispers that Stefan didn't just organize the events, he documented them. Blackmail wasn't a racket, it was an insurance policy. And when that policy became too dangerous to renew, someone cancelled it, permanently. Delon denied everything. Marcantoni said nothing. And Pompidou, behind the curtain of his office, issued a quiet but unmistakable denial. He and his wife knew nothing. But Paris wasn't convinced. Not entirely. 7 top inspectors were now on the case. Too many secrets. Too many bodies. Too much pressure to bury what was already beginning to stink. The Corsican Mafia had graduated. No longer just heroin smugglers or gambling lords. They were political fixers now. Providers of pleasure. Enforcers of silence. And for men like Markovitch, who forgot that these favors came with a leash, the price was simple. 1 bullet no warning, and a funeral covered in shame. By November of 1969, the heroin trade was no longer something that merely passed through Marseille. It lived there, it breathed there. It had a face, a name, and a smell, acrid, chemical, and metallic, like scorched money. La Roseraie, a villa perched in the hills just beyond the city's noise, looked like any quiet country retreat. But inside, it was a womb for poison, disguised as a filthy laundry room. It wasn't silk or velvet that Marseille exported now. It was death, sealed in plastic bags and tracked by Interpol. The police who raided La Roseraie didn't find a gangster's lair. They found what looked like a diaper washing operation gone to hell. Dryers, stoves, and aluminum pots reeking of morphine vapor. Tucked into the corner, 12 bags of white powder that could have passed for soap, and a makeshift gas mask on a chair. On a nearby desk, a pistol waited like punctuation. The man behind the lab, Joseph Cesari, a bartender, a seaman, and, by the mid-1960s, France's most talented heroin chemist. He'd turned Marseille's post-war smuggling hustle into industrial alchemy. Cesari had no diploma, no laboratory coat. Just a set of passed-down instructions, a set of lungs tough enough for boiling fumes, and the nerve to guard his secrets with lead. He was arrested in 1965, sentenced to 7 years. But the real story wasn't his downfall. It was that his conviction did nothing to stop the trade. By then, Marseille's place in the global narcotics economy had hardened into permanence. The city had become the champagne of heroin, its product the purest, its prices the highest, its distribution global. 80% of the heroin reaching the United States was estimated to come from there. The base came in from the east, raw opium from Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon, funneled through Mediterranean ports and hidden inside sacks of cotton or flung overboard into the harbor for retrieval by night patrols. That morphine base, purchased for a few $100s a kilo, would be transformed in Marseille's hills into heroin worth thousands, then cut, recut, and repackaged in America until a single kilo, originally sold for $2,000, brought in 10 times that amount. No formal chemistry degrees were needed, just experience. And blood loyalty. One lab busted in Mimet was run by a man described as both a resistance hero and a lifelong criminal. When the police took his formula, their own chemist couldn't replicate his quality. 90% purity. That fine old hand, one US narcotics agent called it, with something like respect. Maybe they've got pride in their product, but I think the money just keeps them working harder. For nearly a quarter century, only 4 labs had been busted in all of Marseille. That figure didn't represent the absence of crime. It reflected a culture of silence, bribery, and bureaucratic disinterest. To the French authorities, heroin was America's problem, a dirty business from across the Atlantic. Something to be blamed on broken American homes and Hollywood decay. Even after World War II, when Marseille's traditions as a smuggling port began to shift from opium for sailors to heroin for Harlem, the French kept looking away. The Corsican and Sicilian Mafia had carved out a tidy arrangement. France provided the chemistry and the ports, America provided the market and the muscle. The underworld was structured, resilient, and increasingly suburban. Labs were now hidden in sleepy villages where outsiders stuck out and questions died in tight-knit silence. And still, the French police barely scratched the surface, until 2 Riviera teenagers overdosed in August of 1969. Suddenly, heroin wasn't just a foreign plague, it was a French one. The headlines screamed, parents panicked, committees formed, and for the first time, the Cabinet of France took notice. Between August and late September, over 100 people were arrested. Dealers, intermediaries, miners, and foreigners alike. It was the start of a crackdown, or at least the idea of one. But the pressure wasn't entirely domestic. Washington had grown tired of waiting. Assistant Attorney General Richard Kleindienst told Congress that France's inaction risked diplomatic consequences. The French, in typical Gaullist fashion, balked at the accusation, calling it scapegoat politics. The National Criminal Police were so offended they cancelled an Interpol meeting with American agents. But beneath the resentment, things began to shift. Marseille's Narcotics Bureau received 3 top graduates from the French Police Academy, swelling their numbers from 9 to 12. 12 men, to police the heroin capital of the world. They needed more than bodies. They needed laws. The 48-hour rule, limiting how long suspects could be held without charges, had become a liability, and they needed protection. Every time an arrest happened, a killing followed. It was more than code, it was enforcement. And this was the Corsican Mafia's great weapon, just its chemicals or roots, but its fear. The loyalty it bought wasn't just financial, it was existential. You don't talk when silence keeps you alive. American agents suggested constant harassment, make movement difficult, flood the villages with surveillance, choke the trade with eyes. But even that was met with skepticism. The labs were getting smaller, more mobile. The producers were no longer setting up shop for the season. They were ghosts, moving from site to site, always a step ahead. The heroin war had become a chess game played across oceans, and Marseille was still the board. By late 1969, the city of Marseille was no longer a secret. It was an open wound, pulsing with heroin. Every kilo cooked in the hills outside the port became another ghost on the streets of Harlem, Detroit, Montreal, and Los Angeles. But if Marseille was the beating heart of the global drug trade, Corsica was its soul. Hard, remote, unyielding. And it was there, high among the maquis thickets and ancient stone villages, that the invisible syndicate known simply as the Mountain operated like a secret state. The Marseille Narcotics Bureau had just received 3 top graduates from the French Police Academy, finally expanding their paper-thin staff from 9 to 12. 12 men, charged with dismantling the greatest heroin-producing empire in the Western world. 12 against hundreds, against millions, against an empire of loyalty built not on honor but on fear and profit. Joseph Cesari's arrest had changed nothing. Marseille heroin, running 80 to 90% pure, still flooded the ports, hidden in cotton bales, stashed in deep freezers, dropped overboard in the harbor like dead men waiting to be fished out. The chemists, untrained but precise, boiled their formulas in laundry pots and old stoves. They passed down their methods in whispers and by blood. One resistance hero turned narcotics cook had given police his handwritten formula, only for their own experts to botch the purity. 50%, one American agent muttered in disbelief. The guy they caught, he ran 90. That was a fine old hand. France had ignored the storm until it hit their own shores. In August of 1969, 2 teenagers died from overdoses on the Riviera. Suddenly, heroin wasn't just America's shame. It was a French crisis. For weeks, newspapers exploded, committees formed, ministers panicked. From Paris to Nice to the hill villages of Lyon, they began to whisper about what they'd tried to ignore for years. The heroin wasn't just passing through. It had taken root. It had a home. And that home was guarded by silence. But the true source wasn't just Marseille. It was Corsica. In August 1970, a dispatch from Bonifacio, the old fortress town clinging to the cliffs above the sea, pulled back the veil. This wasn't just an island of wine and history. It was the furnace of France's underworld. Corsica, the land of vendettas and freedom songs to Napoleon, was now being named in the same breath as Beirut and Aleppo. It was France's killer factory. It's its own mafia, and it wasn't just local anymore. According to the investigation, Corsican traffickers were now working hand in hand with some of the most fanatical Arab nationalists in the Middle East, multimillionaire Lebanese and Syrian heroin merchants, fluent in French, living in Paris apartments filled with silk and glass, were fueling the veins of American addiction with morphine base brewed in metal drums in back alley labs in Beirut and Aleppo. Some of them, ironically, were also vocal opponents of the United States and allies of the Soviet Union. Their true ally, however, was profit. Their closest kin, the Corsicans. They called each other cousins. The roots were military in precision. Turkish opium was bought, usually in provinces where bribery was second nature. It was smuggled across borders on horses and trucks into Syria and Lebanon. There it was refined into morphine base and shipped across the Mediterranean. In Marseille, the Corsican labs took over, some in the slums, some in seaside villas between Marseille and Nice. The finished product was wrapped, crated, and handed to lieutenants who knew exactly where to send it. To Montreal, to Mexico City, to Palermo, Milan, Naples, to New York, to San Francisco, to every college campus, every slum alley, every high school locker room in America. The heroin was pure. The money was cleaner. It washed back through Corsica to Marseille, to Rome, to the lavish homes of drug princes in Damascus and Beirut. And it bought silence, political protection, untouchability. The Corsican Mafia didn't just know how to kill. They knew how to stay invisible, how to use nationalism, religion, and international distrust as cover for a global business empire that ran on morphine and ended in morgues. They worked with the Sicilian Mafia, with American syndicates, with everyone who needed to move powder and keep their hands clean. And they did it all from a rocky island in the Mediterranean that most Americans couldn't find on a map. Victor Riesel, writing from Bonifacio, put it plainly. Corsica provides France with most of its killers, criminals, and police. It trains all three the same way, with loyalty, violence, and the understanding that silence is worth more than gold. Corsica, he wrote, is not so far from the Middle East after all, nor from New York, nor from the dying teenagers in Detroit, the factory workers in Ohio, the students in Boston, or the broken families in Los Angeles. Corsica, he said, was right next door. By the close of 1970, the Corsican Mafia had evolved beyond Marseille's slums and seaside villas. It was no longer just a network of smugglers. It had matured into something more terrifying, a global corporate entity, diversified, decentralized, and cloaked in legitimacy. Heroin labs still cooked in the hills, but now the real power sat in banks, boardrooms, and beachfront real estate. The white powder had become gold dust, and it was being washed clean in the very institutions meant to protect the public. The Pensacola News Journal, publishing in December 1970, spelled it out in plain English. The Mafia, particularly its Corsican wing, wasn't just investing in drugs, prostitution, and gambling anymore. It was reinvesting its billions into legitimate businesses, nightclubs, motels, insurance agencies, even banks. And New Orleans, with its easy charm and old-world corruption, had become a warning sign of how fast an entire city could fall under the shadow of a velvet-gloved conspiracy. This wasn't about street muscle anymore. This was stockholder crime. Corsican termites, as one investigator called them, had burrowed deep into the foundations of public commerce. They weren't just extorting. They were buying in, buying large, enough stock to exert control, enough control to quietly own without needing to threaten. Though the shadow of the blackjack and brass knuckles was always present, the real weapon now was the balance sheet. Investigative agencies began to surface. Entire firms formed solely to dig into the backgrounds of employees and shareholders. What they found scared them. Not just low-level criminals, but mafiosi with suits, charm, and capital. It wasn't just about laundering money. It was about creating leverage, economic leverage. And in the hands of killers, that leverage could collapse entire sectors. It could coerce unions, intimidate governments, and, in the words of the editorial, exert coercive pressures on the ordinary man who must deal with their businesses. It wasn't far-fetched. It was happening. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, on a chilly spring day in April 1971, the Omaha World Herald carried the bitter truth that American agents had been screaming into the void for years. This was where the real money started. The ancient city, once the capital of empires, had become a center for financiers and commission men, not bankers in the traditional sense, but traffickers of opium, dressed in respectability. The Turkish opium trade, once a sideline, was now an industry. Farmers who sold their gum legally received a meager $3 a pound. But the mob-backed market? 3 to 5 times that. And increasingly, the Turks weren't just supplying the gum. They were converting it themselves into morphine base, compacting their product for easier, more profitable smuggling. A single pound of morphine base could be bought in Istanbul for $2,000. Once handed over to the Corsican Mafia's labs in Marseille, that pound became heroin, worth $20,000 on arrival, and as much as $125,000 once cut and sold on the American street. It was a chain of transformation as elegant as it was lethal. Each handoff added another zero. And the Corsicans controlled the center. Their labs were hidden, mobile, and precise. One American agent put it bluntly. The Corsican Mafia has established a virtual monopoly on the process of turning opium into heroin. They were artisans of death, and their system ran smoother than most governments. The problem, as always, wasn't just the product, it was protection. Turkish police, according to American sources, were riddled with corruption. 2 ships, known to be smuggling heroin, continued to operate with impunity. The commission men remained untouchable behind their facades of wealth. The French and Turkish governments had increased their cooperation, pressured by Washington, but it wasn't enough. The United States Narcotics Bureau had moved its European headquarters from Rome to Paris, because that's where the action was. That's where the labs were. That's where the Corsicans ruled. And underneath it all, the geography was undeniable. The opium started in Turkey. It passed through Lebanon, Syria, and the Mediterranean. It touched Corsica, Marseille, Palermo, and from there it flowed like poison into America, through Montreal, through New Orleans, through Mexico City, through every forgotten alley where the next overdose already had a name. Corsica, Istanbul, Marseille, New York. The line was unbroken. The Corsican Mafia hadn't just built a drug empire. They'd built a parallel economy, one fueled by the weak, enforced by silence, and guarded by men who smiled in public and killed in private. By the spring of 1971, the American heroin crisis had erupted into something no longer deniable. In suburbs, schoolyards, military bases, and college dormitories, young Americans were dropping like flies. From overdoses, from addiction, from despair. But what wasn't being printed in the headlines, what didn't appear on the evening news, was that the white powder creeping through America's veins had been fertilized in the shadow of its own foreign policy. From Indochina to Montana, the same ghosts were making their rounds. According to Ramparts magazine, reprinted by the Retort out of Billings, Montana, heroin had become the leading killer of young Americans aged 18 to 35, eclipsing car crashes, suicides, and even cancer. Cities were under siege. Schools were no longer safe. The American middle class, once insulated, now stood exposed. Addiction no longer wore the face of Harlem alone. It wore varsity jackets and army fatigues. Every day, young U.S. soldiers in Vietnam were dying, not from bullets, but from overdoses. 1 a day. A silent cull of the same generation asked to fight an unwinnable war halfway across the world. While President Nixon vowed to declare war on drugs, his military machine was already plugged into the very arteries of the global opium trade. Because the poppies didn't grow in Brooklyn or Detroit. They bloomed in Laos, The Fertile Triangle, a sprawling remote zone across northern Burma, northern Thailand and Laos, was the cradle of the modern opium trade. There, among jagged peaks and mist-choked forests, the Mio hill tribes lived off a singular ancient cash crop, the opium poppy. The Mio worked the harvest like religion. Men hacked back the jungle in the wet season. Women slit the pods when they bloomed, red, purple, and white, and drained the milky latex that bled out. It was boiled, filtered, and pressed into sticky black balls, sold for $50 a kilo at remote meetups with local smugglers. That same kilo would go for $200 in Saigon, $2,000 in San Francisco. It was a natural economy of scale, but it wasn't just locals running the show. Behind the villagers, the smugglers. Behind the smugglers, the militias. And behind the militias, the CIA ramparts laid it bare. US covert policy in Southeast Asia had not only created the conditions for heroin trafficking, it had armed it. The Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek's exiled army, had been routed from mainland China in 1949. But remnants of his 93rd Division held strong in the Thai-Burmese borderlands, supported quietly by Taipei and coordinated by the CIA. These KMT remnants were no ragtag leftovers. They maintained a standing army of 5,000 to 7,000 men, funded themselves through the opium trade, and operated like a sovereign state in the hills. They bought poppy resin from the Mio, processed it into morphine, and then sold it up the chain. In return, they offered the US intelligence services something more valuable than heroin: access. They ran missions into China, recruited guerrillas in Burma, worked alongside Thai counterinsurgency efforts, and all the while they financed their operations with the same poppy latex that was killing American kids in alleyways. In 1959, Burmese forces raided a KMT airstrip and seized 3 opium processing plants in Wonton. But the game simply shifted. By 1961, the KMT had re-established themselves along the Thai-Burmese and Thai-Laotian borders. They now operated at least 8 fortified village bases. The CIA didn't just tolerate it, it ran alongside it. In Chiang Mai, Thailand's hilltop city, the arrangement was impossible to miss. American advisors, Taiwanese military officials, and KMT officers all worked side by side. Helicopters buzzed from post to post, ferrying KMT soldiers for rest and relaxation, and even organized basketball tournaments. Air America, ostensibly a civilian airline, was in reality a CIA front. It transported not just personnel, but in many cases cargo. And in the air over Laos and Thailand, no one was checking manifests too closely. The Border Patrol Police, BPP, originally trained by the CIA and now financed through AID, served as both law enforcement and logistics, guarding the smuggling routes, keeping the opium flowing, and taking their cut along the way. Their commander, General Prapas Charusatara, was the second most powerful man in Thailand. The CIA called him a strategic ally. The traffickers called him a guarantee. And where did the drugs go? They traveled by caravan, sometimes a mile long. 200 mules, 200 porters, 200 cooks, 400 armed guards, 15 tons of raw opium moving slowly but unstoppably toward the next stage of its transformation. Some shipments were flown out of Bangkok. Others were floating through the Gulf of Siam. Some ended up in Hong Kong, some in Singapore, some in Marseille, where Corsican chemists waited with acetone and cauldrons to turn morphine into heroin. Then came the final journey, to Mexico City, Montreal, or straight into New York. There it would be sold, cut, repackaged, and shot into the bloodstream of the country that had accidentally manufactured the crisis. The US military was supplying troops with amphetamines, while quietly ignoring the heroin being pumped in through its own back channels. Drug rehab programs were being funded with one hand, while airlifts of raw narcotics flew with the other. America was trying to fight a war and cover up a drug pipeline at the same time, and lost both battles. What started as an anti-communist crusade had mutated into a logistical corridor for opium. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was a supply chain. The syndicate in Marseille, the commission men in Istanbul, the Mio farmers in Laos, the CIA handlers in Chiang Mai, and the dead teenagers in Des Moines. This wasn't coincidence. It was policy. By late April 1971, the truth was bleeding out faster than anyone in Washington could patch it up. The bodies, the needles, the overdoses, none of it could be brushed away anymore. What had once been a quiet pipeline, tucked into the shadows of foreign policy and secrecy, now ran with the same urgency and exposure as the war that birthed it. Heroin was no longer a back-alley affliction. It had metastasized into the bloodstream of the United States, its source traced, with unflinching precision, to the same coordinates as America's holy war in Indochina. Long Cheng. The name barely made it onto maps. Hidden 80 miles northeast of Vientiane, it was a CIA-built fortress, tucked high in the Laotian mountains, a covert wartime capital and the heart of a narcotics empire masquerading as a counterinsurgency campaign. Built during the Geneva Accords period of 1962, the base became home to 50,000 Mio tribesmen, many of them displaced refugees, all of them surrounded by CIA advisors, Thai mercenaries, and a harvest of poppies. That opium was their only currency, their only future. It was also the reason they were dying. By 1964, the CIA had turned Longchang into a narcotics depot. Armed CIA agents stood on runways next to T-28 bombers, while piles of opium lay in open-air markets, going for $52 a kilo. Reporters weren't welcome. But a few, like Carl Strock of the Far Eastern Economic Review, managed to slip through. What they saw confirmed what addicts in New York and San Francisco were dying from. This wasn't just war. It was commerce. The CIA, operating under the same counterinsurgency doctrine used in Guatemala and Iran, protected those opium-laden flights. They gave clearance. They gave cover. While American boys overdosed in bunkers, the planes flew uninterrupted. Ramparts magazine had laid the charges, and Washington scrambled. Vice President Nguyen Cao Ky called Senator George McGovern a member of the international communist conspiracy for even suggesting such things. CIA Director Richard Helms broke protocol and made a public speech, denying everything. But the denials were too late, because the facts were too solid, and the names, well, they were already in ink. Kai wasn't some rogue actor. He had been handpicked. He had glittered at the top of the Caravel Hotel, throwing cocktail parties on a military salary that wouldn't pay for a single bottle of champagne. By the time he assumed real power in 1965, he was already known to have replaced Madame Nu in Saigon's heroin syndicate. He ran flights from Pleiku to Saigon loaded with between 200 to 2,000 kilos of opium. The operation was so routine, one American intelligence officer remarked, it had lost all its adventure. If you wanted in on the business, you had two choices: work for the CIA or join Air America. That was the route taken by a young black veteran who returned from Indochina and told Ramparts he had gone to Vietnam, hoping to get in on the dope trade. But the trade was locked down, controlled by a structure like the Mafia. The only way to break in? I work for the company, Air America, the CIA's own airline. From there, he said, you could see the crystals everywhere. This was no longer about rogue elements or errant soldiers. It was about the system. The traditional opium corridors, from India through the Middle East into Europe, had been rerouted. The Corsican Mafia's grip, once dominant from Marseille to Havana, had been slowly usurped by a more silent, efficient replacement. American-funded paramilitaries, CIA-chartered flights, and a caste of warlords whose allegiance came in gold, not flags. The Mio people, who once raised their crops in peace, were now a shattered demographic. Their army, once a regional force, had been reduced to child soldiers. Their population halved. Their legacy. To be used as pawns in a war they never understood, then left to rot with a drug that paid for it. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't oversight. It was policy. From Chiang Kai-shek's KMT guerrillas to Saigon's dragon ladies, from Richard Nixon's advisors to the slick corporate infrastructure of Air America, this was an international narcotics empire, backed by military logistics, diplomatic immunity, and Cold War paranoia. Madame Nu ran the Saigon scene before being ousted. Madame Kai filled the vacuum. Meanwhile, back in the States, heroin had begun its quiet invasion. Into the ghettos, into the suburbs, into the veins of American teenagers. It came with military precision, delivered by the very apparatus meant to protect the country from evil. Instead, it delivered evil in powder form. Nixon, backed by the old China lobby and architects of Cold War realpolitik, didn't just ignore the roots of the heroin crisis, he enabled it. While public hearings probed organized crime, the real pipeline, from the Fertile Triangle to the Bronx, remained sacred ground. Off limits. Unexamined. Because exposing it would mean unraveling the entire foreign policy doctrine of Southeast Asia. In the words of Ramparts, the United States has, as a reflex of its warfare in Indochina, built up a support system for the trade in narcotics that is unparalleled in modern history. The piratical Corsican transporters have been replaced by pragmatic technocrats carrying out their jobs with deadly accuracy. The heroin trade was no longer an underworld affair. It was infrastructure. It was foreign policy. It was the dark dividend of America's war on communism. And it had come home, quietly, efficiently, permanently. On a sweltering June morning in 1971, with the Bosphorus sparkling under a cruel Turkish sun, Istanbul pulsed like a living artery of the global heroin trade. Once the jeweled seat of sultans, now it was a different empire's capital, a narcotic capital, teeming with brokers in well-pressed suits who never touched a grain of powder themselves. Here, behind the aged grandeur of the Topkapi Palace and the muezzin's call echoing off the stones of St. Sophia, the real business of the city was opium. This was where the big money started to roll. The American agents called them financiers, Turkish gentlemen with manicured fingernails and government connections, who greased the wheels of the trade. They never met the farmers, never touched the gum, never got close to the blood and dirt of the poppy fields. But they controlled it all. In the villages scattered across the Anatolian plains, the opium gum was gathered in burlap sacks by men whose hands were rough from scraping pods. If sold to the government, a farmer might earn $3 a pound. But if he sold to the underground market, he could make 5 times that. So, the choice wasn't a choice at all. With a nod from the local village head, the gum disappeared off the official books and into the invisible hands of the underworld. From there, the operation ran like a global corporation with invisible stockholders and no annual report. 10 pounds of opium gum yielded just 1 pound of morphine base, but that pound could be moved, concealed, and sold with far greater ease. By the time it left Turkey, that pound, worth $2,000 on the Istanbul market, would be 10 times that in Marseille. And from there, it became something else entirely. It became heroin. The Corsican Mafia had ruled the French Connection since the mid-1930s, a loose confederation of chemists, smugglers, and killers who operated labs so mobile they were practically ghosts. Their laboratories, hidden in the cracks of Marseille, were the last stop before the powder hit the veins of American addicts. A single pound of morphine base was cooked into heroin, bagged and branded, and sold wholesale for $20,000. Cut and diluted on the streets of Chicago, Harlem, or Los Angeles, that same pound could fetch up to 125,000. That was the real empire now, the empire of the White Death. United States narcotics agents, pacing hotel lobbies in Istanbul or sweating through diplomatic handshakes, knew the pipeline by heart. They had it mapped. A third of the product traveled the old trail through Syria and Lebanon. Another third slipped into Europe through cargo ships from Turkish ports. The rest rolled on rubber, hidden in cars and trucks that vanished into the forests of Eastern Europe. But even as American agents sounded the alarm, their own government was faltering under the weight of its contradictions. That summer, President Nixon and Attorney General John Mitchell were trumpeting supposed cooperation from the French in breaking the heroin trade. But inside the embassy walls in Paris, the messages told a very different story, one lined with betrayal, silence, and fixes at the highest levels of French police. The Corsicans were protected, no raids, no shutdowns. The labs hummed in the shadows, untouched. And back in the States, the politics were no less toxic. On August 5th, 1971, while Nixon's White House celebrated a new anti-narcotics partnership with France, panic was rippling through the corridors of the Central Intelligence Agency. In Pakistan, a field agent had sent an encrypted message. Henry Kissinger's flight to Peking included an unlisted Chinese passenger. Alarms went off. Was it espionage? A kidnapping plot? It turned out to be nothing more than a Chinese navigator. But it was a glimpse behind the curtain, into a government stretched thin between Cold War diplomacy, domestic decay, and the booming heroin trade flooding American cities. In Washington, loyalties were cracking. Anna Chennault, the dragon lady of the China lobby and longtime Nixon ally, was cursing the president behind closed doors for his trip to Red China. Fundraisers braced for her revenge. Meanwhile, Cesar Chavez was mounting an offensive of his own against the Farm Bureau, whose quiet sabotage of an international wheat agreement had sent shockwaves through foreign capitals. Canada, Japan, and the nations of Western Europe were furious. America had promised a fair price floor for wheat. Instead, traders undercut the agreement and pocketed the profits. And somewhere between these headlines, heroin in the gutters, wheat corruption in the boardrooms, betrayal in the embassies, sat Lyndon B. Johnson, struggling to sell the story of his presidency. His memoir, The Vantage Point, was languishing in limbo. The New York Times had offered just $25,000. Lady Bird had done 4 times better with her White House diary. Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston tried to spin it. Strong demand, they said. But no one was buying. The heroin still flowed, and in the shadow of it all, on the marble steps of the Capitol and the scorched fields of Anatolia, the lines between crime and diplomacy, war and commerce, were blurring into something no policy speech could fix. Not in Istanbul, not in Marseille, not in Washington.